All right. In the past, we dealt with problems like finding 75% of 200 or finding 75% of 50. And one way that we discussed in terms of how to figure this out is to use this equation. And the equation is that our part is always equal to some percent of our whole amount. So in this problem right here, if I want to find 75% of 200, this of 200 was my whole amount. So I would just plug in 200 right there, and I want to find 75% of that. And whatever 0.75 times 200 is, that's going to be your part. In this one, you could think through in your head, it's going to be 150 because 75% is like 3/4. A fourth of 200 is 50, and then 3 of those fourths is 150. But if you're not comfortable thinking it through in your head, you of course can type it in your calculator, and it was 0.75 for 75%. You always want to type that in decimal form, and there's the 150. So your part is 150. Okay, so what that means is in picture form, so let me draw a rectangle here. So if that represents my whole amount, so that bar that I've just drawn represents 100% or everything that I'm starting with. And remember the word of, you can think of in two ways. Number one, you can think of as multiplication, which is why you're doing 0.75 times 200. Or you can realize that when you say of 200, it's out of that whole amount. So all of it that I start with, or 100% of what I start with, represents 200. Now, if I find 75% of that, I basically want to know, what is, so 75%. So let me try to draw this. So 75%. So I'm trying to draw this into fourths the best I can. So this would be 25%, 50%. So 75% would be right there. And 75% of the 200 is, in fact, 150. So notice that when I take 75% of that 200, in terms of what I've lost 25% of what I started with. And when I lost that 25% of what I started with as a number, like let's say this was $200, I've lost 50 of those dollars. 25% of the 200 would be 50. So here's where we're headed. It's really this same kind of idea, but they're going to use some different words in there. Instead of referring to something as the whole amount, you're going to want to think of this as the original price. So we're going to be dealing with discounts here, and you're going to have some kind of original price. That's your whole amount. In many word problems involving percent of increase or percent of decrease, you always have some value that you start with, and working with that value, you calculate this second value. So your original price is your starting amount, and your starting amount is your whole amount. So you can kind of tie these three things together in the same group: starting amount, original price, whole amount. Now, whenever you take your percent, realize there's going to be two different ways that you can do that. You can either A, take the percent that you lose. So you can write in the percent as how much did you lose. Or B, you can take your percent in terms of what is your new amount. And in the example that we just talked about, if I'm going from 100% to 75%, the amount that I'm losing would be 25%. So I could do 25% of 200, and that's going to go directly across from this 25% in this picture. That's going to be this 50. 25% of 200, I'm basically losing 50 of what I started with. Or the second way that I can view this percent is to say that, okay, well, if I'm losing 25%, then what I have left over is 75%. So my new amount is going to be 75% of what I started with. So the other way that you can kind of think through this is to realize that you're taking 75% of 200, and that's giving you the 150. Now, another thing that's going to be very tricky in these problems, so, well, before I say that, the amount that I lose, that's going to basically be my discount. So in your problems, you're going to see all these problems that say like, well, the discount is this much. Well, that's the amount that I've lost. In this picture, so let's color code this. In this picture, my discount is the amount that I lose, and that's this value right here as a percent. That's this value right here as a number. Or the second percent is my new amount, and my new amount is 75% of what I started with because I lost 25, and as an amount, that's 150. The other thing that's going to be tricky is that you're going to have to be very careful with problems that say, what is the original price? Or when you don't have the original price. So sometimes this whole amount is just going to be some unknown X value, and you're going to have to adjust from there. So when that's the case, when you have the original price that you don't know, you're going to want to use this guy right here. You're going to want to say, okay, so if I lose this much, I now have left this percent of what I started with. So let's say that, I had a problem that said my discount is 25%. And now the new price is $150. In that case, you're basically saying, all right, so I am taking 75% of some starting amount, X, 0.75 times X, and that's going to equal the 150. So very, very tricky. If you don't know the original price, you're going to put in this variable here that you don't know it. And then the second tricky thing is that when you have those problems, you're going to have to work with this percent or the new amount percent. So what do you have left over after you take your discount?